Minister had addressed the virtual summit in March this year. He said that Quad is a force for the good. It has a positive vision. It will extend India's vision of Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or the world as one family. Should other countries not have any misgivings at all? Only recently we heard what the External Affairs Minister had to say on some criticism coming from China, saying that this is an Asian NATO, but he also said that this is total misrepresentation of the reality. What would you say?
China, from the very beginning, has been very concerned with these four countries coming together. Three of them, which is the United States, Australia, and Japan, are already in alliance relationship. What I think that disturbs China particularly is the largest, most powerful neighbor of China, India, apparently also sitting on the same big table with these three countries to join it. And what is particularly sensitive for China is that when you talk about the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea forms the hub of that imagination of Indo-Pacific littoral. And because China constantly claims sovereignty over this huge area, 1.3 million square kilometers area, is why this is concerned. If it treats South China Sea as a free and open sea, then China has nothing to fear. But you notice that all leaders, including Indian Prime Minister, has also lately started talking about how these four are united by their basic values of democracy, liberty, free trade. And he underlines a free and open Indo-Pacific by adding that he wants to see it secure, prosperous, and stable Indo-Pacific, which is slightly different compared to how United States focuses primarily, or even Japan and Australia focuses on freedom of navigation being the primary focus. So China has natural reasons to be concerned, but of course, every time these four leaders at various levels meet, they have tried to clarify that this is not aimed at any third country, and your report in the beginning just outlined a whole range of issues that these leaders are together going to address, and they talk about deepening their ties, looking at building of the more practical cooperation on issues that concern them, for example, from education to humanitarian aid to issues like pandemic and vaccine production. These are examples of how this is very differently focused on ensuring stability, security, and prosperity in the entire region. And Chinese should have, ideally speaking, no reason to worry, but because they want to constantly claim their sovereignty on South China Sea, and that is an area which they describe as their core interest and are sensitive about it, is why they think that these four countries with enormous maritime footprint and capabilities might potentially perhaps claim that freedom of navigation, which Chinese perhaps want to deny to the rest of the world, which is completely unfair. So China has its very own reasons to be disturbed about, but I don't think that Quad leaders need to be defensive and need to explain it anymore. Because if you look at the agenda, the way it has evolved, the way three working groups were organized last time, they are not focused on China. They are not focused on military security. Indian Prime Minister has said it repeatedly. We don't want to see Indo-Pacific getting either militarized or exclusive to any number of countries. India has been open to including Russia and China, which are critical of Indo-Pacific and Quad, to also come and talk to these countries and be part of the narrative. So I think India, in that sense, also works as a slightly interesting country, which can potentially connect both China and Russia to the Indo-Pacific discourses, which perhaps others may not have that kind of credibility to carry on. But to finally underline the fact that you hear these statements coming from Beijing's Minister of Foreign Affairs spokesperson is only a reflection of China's own paranoia. Otherwise, if you look at what these four leaders are trying to focus on, absolutely nothing relates to them on China focus or anti-China activities.
Is the focus both in the Quad and the UNGA also going to be on the developments in Afghanistan and the security and humanitarian concerns that are emanating from there and the need to hold the Taliban to its promises?
I think clearly the entire world, all regional and international meetings lately have had their leaders, the Taliban on their mind. It's a very strange situation of what I call regime change in the reverse. A US-supported government has been forcibly, brutally removed by the Taliban, and that really disturbs the entire international community. So at various levels, for example, recently the US Foreign Minister, the Secretary of State, addressed 22 foreign ministers to build that global consensus, because world must come together to not grant recognition or legitimacy to Taliban unless some of the basic conditions are met. And I think these four leaders are likewise going to coordinate as to how they are going to work together, particularly because Australia, Japan, United States had invested enormously. India also had invested enormously in Afghanistan. So they have direct stakes to ensure that the 20 years of work that they have put in during last 20 years is not completely demolished by Taliban. And Taliban must ensure a few basic things. And India has been talking about restriction on violence, no violence on the ground, safety of people of Indian origin, Indian citizens, and ensuring that Taliban doesn't allow Afghanistan to be used against any of the neighboring countries by terrorist outfits. So these are some of the basic conditions, or all other issues like human rights or women's rights, which are built over a period of time into the polity of Afghanistan, must be protected. So I'm sure, other than the fact that United States has already allocated, for example, $61 million for humanitarian aid in Afghanistan, likewise other countries are going to focus. I think immediate issue on their mind will be how to ensure humanitarian aid and assistance on the ground, but likewise also focus on restraining Taliban and socializing Taliban to basic norms of governance. So I'm sure that is going to be one more important issue on their table, on their discussion, other than issues of pandemic. But briefly in 30 seconds, we also need to notice China's paranoia perhaps is much more coming from the voices that you hear from the United States, and not necessarily from voices that come from India. With India, engagement of China is very different. You heard National Security Advisor today only saying that this Quad should also focus on other issues which they hold dear to American interests. For example, what is happening in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, what is happening in Taiwan Straits. So they also want
You would remember that in the last readout of the Prof Swaran Singh, let's shift focus to multilateralism and the need for reforms in the UN. UN reform is a key aspect of India's engagement with the United Nations. Year after year, we hear India describing its position on how the present decision making structures in the UN do not reflect the present day realities of the 21st century. Are there certain countries that are paying only lip service to the issue of UN reforms and thwarting progress on the matter?
There is clearly the indication in your question to China. China has been the one paying only lip service, talking about India having a greater role in global decision making or in international organizations or United Nations. That is simply because it sees India as a challenger in United Nations in case India becomes a permanent member of UN Security Council, a country of equal size, a developing country, another large Asian country, with perhaps a much greater acceptance level and credibility with the rest of the world compared to China. So China has to get worried if India gets a permanent seat with a veto on UN Security Council. So therefore, that may be a very difficult anticipation. Of course, the debate continues on reformations, not only to include India, but a lot of other structures of United Nations need also to be reformed over a period of time. They were reformed several times over the last 70 years as the world changes on the ground. Now, of course, UN Security Council, the core and the most important organ of United Nations, also need to really revamp. But let me just add in, what is important here is to also note that even when the structural reforms are not coming our way very easily, there is a clearly much greater recognition and anticipation and expectation that the world is repeatedly showing from India's global role. And you can see one after another, whenever India is called for playing a certain role, there is much easier consensus that builds up around India's voice. And the last example is the fact that for the eighth time, India has now joined as non-permanent member of UN Security Council with 184 countries out of 190 countries, 93 countries supporting India's candidature. So I think that reflection of reality de facto as to how the world is increasingly engaging India itself lends a certain amount of credibility and I dare say even weight to India's argument. And I think the world is beginning to notice that, and so also those countries that are distractors of India in terms of allowing India its well-deserved role and status in United Nations structures. But this may not be easy to come India's way, so India has to focus how to increase the leverages that India has. And I think this meeting at Quadrilateral Security Framework in Washington, D.C. is an example. India's Prime Minister being invited to G7 summits is an example. So India's voice is increasingly being heard, and I think we have to really hone our skills, prepare ourselves for these increased responsibilities that come our way. India is now the chairman of the World Health Board, for example, World Health Assembly, which is also undergoing, desire for certain reforms. Right. So many places, whether it is regional or global, India should constantly prepare itself to deliver to the anticipations that world has from India.